The radio call cut through the cold morning air like a blade, and in that instant, everything on Fifth Street froze, as if time itself had been ordered to stand down, because nothing in that moment felt routine anymore. "Step out of the vehicle, now." Officer Daniel Reed's voice echoed sharply across the intersection, drawing the attention of pedestrians who had been walking to work just seconds earlier, coffee cups still steaming in their hands. Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson stood beside a black pickup truck parked near the curb, his uniform crisp despite the long night travel from base, the fabric still carrying the faint dust of miles behind him, and yet his posture remained steady, almost unnervingly calm for a man who now found himself surrounded by flashing lights and growing suspicion. The early sun reflected off the metal badges of 3 patrol units that had arrived within minutes, their presence turning a simple traffic stop into something heavier, something charged with uncertainty and quiet tension. Marcus did not raise his voice, did not reach for sudden movements. Instead, he slowly placed his hands where they could be seen, his eyes scanning the officers not with defiance, but with the controlled patience of someone trained to operate under pressure far beyond this street corner. "Sir, I need you to comply immediately," Reed continued, stepping closer, his tone firm, his assumption already written in his expression before a single fact had been verified. A small crowd had formed now, phones lifted, recording in silence, the kind of modern witness that changes the weight of every decision made in public space. Marcus exhaled slowly, his voice calm when he finally spoke, measured like he was choosing each word with care. "Officer, I am Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, United States Army, returning from assignment, and I am asking you to verify my identification before proceeding further." For a brief moment, there was hesitation, but it was not enough to break the momentum already building around the misunderstanding, and Reed's response came quick, sharper than before, dismissing the statement as if it were part of a script he had already decided to reject. The air felt tighter now, not because of movement, but because of perception, because assumptions were taking the place of facts in real time, and every second added weight to something that was already spiraling beyond a simple encounter. Marcus reached slowly into his pocket and retrieved his military identification, holding it outward without stepping forward, without challenging distance, only presenting what should have been enough to end the situation, yet the reaction he received told a different story. The officer glanced at it briefly but did not relax, instead signaling to another unit, as if confirmation itself required escalation rather than clarity. Around them, the city continued moving in the background, buses passing, traffic lights cycling, life continuing in parallel to a moment that felt increasingly disconnected from reason. Marcus's gaze shifted briefly toward the horizon, not in frustration, but in awareness, as though he understood something the others did not yet see forming beneath the surface of this encounter. Then, with a voice lower than before, he spoke one sentence that changed the tone of everything that followed. "Contact the Pentagon liaison." There was no anger in it, no threat, only instruction, delivered with the certainty of someone who had already lived through systems far larger than the one standing in front of him. And in that instant, even the air seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to continue as it was or prepare for what came next. The silence that followed his request did not feel empty. It felt suspended, like the entire intersection had been placed under an invisible weight that no one fully understood but everyone could sense. And within that suspended moment, Officer Daniel Reed tightened his grip on procedure as if structure alone could justify what intuition had not yet confirmed. Marcus Johnson remained still beside the vehicle, his eyes calm but observant, tracking every movement without resistance, without escalation, as if he had learned long ago that control was not always about force but about endurance under misinterpretation. Around them, the crowd had grown denser, commuters slowing their steps, some raising phones higher not out of certainty but curiosity, drawn into a situation that no longer felt like a routine enforcement stop but something layered with authority beyond the street-level interaction. Reed stepped slightly to the side, speaking into his shoulder radio with clipped urgency, requesting verification on military credentials that he had already begun to doubt in his own way, though he would not admit it outwardly, and that doubt created a tension that spread quietly through the line of officers standing behind him. Marcus finally lowered his hand from the position he had been instructed to hold and retrieved his identification once more, extending it with deliberate patience toward the nearest officer, his voice steady when he repeated, "This can be verified through military command channels. I am currently attached to United States Army Special Operations Command." The words were not loud, but they carried a different kind of weight, the kind that does not rely on volume to establish presence. And for a brief second, one of the younger officers hesitated, glancing between Reed and the identification card as if waiting for permission to interpret what he was seeing. Reed's expression tightened further, not out of certainty now, but out of the pressure that comes when uncertainty begins to grow in front of witnesses, and he responded by increasing procedural formality, calling for additional confirmation rather than accepting the one already in his hand. Marcus did not react to the delay, only shifted his stance slightly to remain visible to all cameras and all eyes, his discipline holding steady even as the situation moved further away from resolution. The morning traffic continued to pass behind them, but it felt distant now, as if the intersection had become isolated from the rest of the city, a contained space where decisions were being made under observation from both authority and public scrutiny. Then, without warning or dramatic change in tone, Marcus spoke again, not to challenge, not to argue, but to initiate escalation through the only channel that carried weight beyond the local level. "I am requesting immediate contact with the Pentagon liaison officer assigned to my unit." The statement was precise, formal, and absolute, and it caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere that was not visible but felt, as if the structure of authority in the scene had begun to tilt toward a larger system waiting just beyond reach. Reed paused for a fraction longer than before, his confidence now competing with protocol, and for the first time he did not immediately respond with dismissal, but instead looked toward his radio, as if considering what he was about to unlock by making that call, while Marcus remained completely still, aware that the next few minutes would determine not only how this encounter ended, but how quickly the system above them would decide to respond. The moment Marcus Johnson's request for direct liaison contact entered the radio system, the atmosphere around the intersection shifted in a way that was not immediate but cumulative, as if every second that passed was quietly transferring authority from the street-level officers to a chain of command far beyond their visibility. Officer Daniel Reed stood slightly turned toward his vehicle, one hand resting near the radio unit, his expression controlled but no longer fully anchored in certainty, because requests of that level were not standard procedure for routine identification checks, and everyone present could sense that the situation had crossed an invisible threshold. Marcus remained where he was positioned, neither advancing nor retreating, maintaining a stance that reflected discipline rather than confrontation, his uniform still sharp despite the tension surrounding him, the insignia on his chest catching brief reflections of passing headlights as morning traffic continued to flow around the blocked intersection. The crowd had grown quieter now, not dispersing but observing with a focus that had replaced earlier curiosity, and several phones remained raised, capturing every detail of a moment that felt increasingly detached from its original purpose. Reed spoke briefly into the radio again, this time with less certainty in his tone, requesting expedited verification through military channels, and as he waited for response, the seconds stretched in a way that made the entire scene feel slower, heavier, as if time itself was responding to the escalation. Marcus finally shifted his gaze toward the officers, his voice calm but firm when he added a clarification that carried procedural precision rather than emotional intensity, stating that his assignment status required confirmation through United States Army Special Operations Command liaison protocols. That statement introduced a new layer into the interaction, because it was no longer just about identification but about classification, and the officers around Reed exchanged brief glances that suggested awareness of how quickly a standard stop could transition into something requiring external authority review. Reed's radio crackled with partial responses, fragments of confirmation requests being relayed upward, and for the first time his posture showed a subtle reduction in confidence, not visible as hesitation to the public, but perceptible in the way he adjusted his stance and re-evaluated distance between himself and Marcus. The younger officer beside him leaned slightly forward, watching the identification card more carefully now, as if trying to reconcile what had been assumed with what was being verified in real time. Marcus did not move to close any distance or assert dominance, instead remaining centered, composed, and fully aware that escalation at this level did not require physical expression, only procedural accuracy and confirmation from the correct authority channels. Around them, the environment continued its contrast between ordinary city motion and concentrated tension, buses passing in the background, pedestrians slowing as they approached the intersection, unaware of the full context but sensitive to the seriousness that had taken hold. Reed finally lowered his radio slightly, waiting for the next response from dispatch, and in that pause the entire scene felt suspended again, not in confusion this time, but in anticipation of something larger beginning to respond beyond the visible frame of the street. The stillness that followed the radio exchange was no longer simple silence. It had become a waiting space filled with unspoken authority, as if the intersection itself was holding its breath for confirmation from a level of command that existed far beyond the street. Officer Daniel Reed stood near the front of his patrol unit, one hand resting on the open door frame, the other holding the radio slightly away from his mouth, listening more than speaking now, because what had begun as a standard verification request had already expanded into a chain of responses that no longer felt local in scale. Marcus Johnson remained in the same position beside the black pickup truck, his posture unchanged, steady and deliberate, his attention fixed not on the officers but on the process unfolding beyond them, as if he understood that the real conversation was happening somewhere far above this intersection, in systems designed for situations that most people would never witness directly. The crowd had shifted again, not growing louder, but more focused, a quiet tension spreading through those watching as they realized this was no longer a simple misunderstanding being resolved in real time. Several officers stepped slightly apart from each other, creating small gaps in their formation, subtle physical signs of uncertainty that contrasted with their earlier confidence. Reed finally received a transmission through his radio, and the change in his expression was immediate but controlled, his eyes tightening slightly as he absorbed information that required him to reassess everything he had assumed minutes earlier. The message was not fully audible to those around him, but fragments carried through the static, referencing active duty verification protocols and direct liaison confirmation requirements, language that shifted the situation into a category that demanded immediate procedural adjustment. Marcus did not react outwardly, but his gaze shifted briefly toward Reed, acknowledging the progression without altering his composure. The younger officer nearby lowered his chin slightly, now clearly reading the identification card with renewed seriousness, as if seeing details that had previously been overlooked. Reed spoke again into the radio, this time slower, requesting confirmation of Pentagon-level contact initiation, and the response that came back required him to pause before acknowledging it, because the instruction was not to continue verification at the local level, but to hold position and await direct communication from military command channels. That instruction changed the energy at the scene in a measurable way, because it removed authority from the immediate environment and placed it somewhere else entirely, leaving the officers in a temporary state of procedural suspension. Traffic behind them continued to move, but even that motion felt distant, like a parallel routine existing beside a situation that had separated itself from normal civic flow. Marcus adjusted his stance slightly, not out of discomfort but out of patience, as if he had experienced enough similar transitions to recognize the rhythm of escalation when it reached this stage. Reed lowered his radio completely now, exhaling slowly through his nose as he looked briefly toward the intersection, then back at Marcus, not with hostility, but with a recalibration of perception that was still in progress. No one spoke for several seconds, and in that gap the realization settled more deeply among those present that whatever was about to arrive would not be local, not discretionary, and not subject to interpretation at the street level. The system had already begun to respond, and the only thing remaining in this moment was the arrival of its confirmation. The moment the radio finally shifted from static verification to a clear directive, the entire intersection felt as if it had entered a different operational reality, one that no longer belonged to the officers on the ground, but to a command structure far beyond their immediate authority. Officer Daniel Reed stood still beside the patrol unit, his posture no longer assertive in the way it had been earlier, but controlled in a more careful sense, as if every movement now required internal confirmation before execution. The transmission he had just received was not ambiguous, not suggestive, and not procedural in the usual sense of escalation. It was definitive in its instruction to hold position and await. Direct military communication. Around him, the other officers subtly adjusted their spacing, no longer forming a confident perimeter but a loose formation shaped more by uncertainty than intent. Marcus Johnson remained exactly where he had been since the beginning of the encounter, his stance unchanged, his uniform still sharply aligned despite the passage of time and pressure of scrutiny, his expression calm in a way that suggested familiarity with moments like this, where verification replaced assumption and systems corrected themselves in real time. The crowd that had gathered earlier now stood in quieter observation, no longer reacting in bursts of curiosity, but instead watching with sustained attention, as if understanding that the situation had moved beyond local interpretation. A few vehicles passed slowly around the blocked intersection, but even traffic seemed to adjust its pace, sensing the unusual stillness concentrated at this single point in the city. Reed lowered his radio completely, allowing it to rest near his chest as he exhaled through a controlled breath, his eyes briefly scanning the identification details once more, not because he doubted the document itself now, but because he was processing the implications of the response he had just received. One of the junior officers leaned slightly closer, speaking in a low voice that did not carry far, asking whether they should maintain the current detainment posture. But Reed did not answer immediately, his attention divided between protocol memory and the reality unfolding in front of him. Marcus finally shifted his gaze toward Reed, not with pressure or challenge, but with calm awareness, as if acknowledging that the situation had reached its necessary stage of clarification. The radio on Reed's shoulder crackled again, this time with a more structured transmission, referencing direct military liaison activation and command-level acknowledgement, language that confirmed this was no longer a local verification matter but an active coordination request from higher authority channels. The shift was subtle but undeniable, because the officers who had been confident minutes earlier now stood in a state of procedural pause, waiting for instructions that would redefine their role in the interaction. Reed stepped slightly back from the front of the patrol unit, not retreating, but repositioning himself into observation rather than enforcement, his eyes moving between Marcus and the radio as he processed the change in operational status. Marcus remained composed, hands relaxed at his sides, his presence steady and unchanged, as if the escalation confirmed rather than disrupted his expectations of how such systems would respond. The intersection itself seemed quieter now, not because activity had stopped, but because authority had shifted away from visible space and into communication channels that were no longer audible to those standing there. The quiet that settled over the intersection was no longer the silence of confusion or hesitation, but a controlled stillness shaped by the recognition that authority had shifted beyond what any visible presence on the street could directly manage. Officer Daniel Reed stood near the front of his patrol unit, his radio now resting idle in his hand, no longer actively transmitting, but still holding the weight of what had already been sent upward through the chain of command. His posture had softened into observation rather than enforcement, not because he had abandoned procedure, but because procedure itself had moved beyond his level of control. Around him, the other officers maintained their positions with subtle adjustments, no longer forming a rigid perimeter but a loose arrangement defined by waiting rather than action. Marcus Johnson remained at the center of that space, unchanged in stance and demeanor, his presence steady in a way that contrasted with the shifting uncertainty around him. He did not speak, did not signal urgency, and did not attempt to accelerate the process unfolding above them, because his awareness of military communication systems made him fully understand that once activated, these channels operated on their own timeline, independent of local interpretation or control. The crowd that had gathered earlier had not dispersed, but their behavior had changed noticeably, with fewer movements, fewer voices, and a collective focus that suggested they were witnessing something outside of ordinary civic encounters. A few individuals lowered their phones slightly, not because they had lost interest, but because the nature of what they were observing no longer fit into simple categories of explanation or commentary. Traffic continued to flow around the blocked intersection in slow, cautious patterns, drivers briefly turning their heads as they passed, sensing the unusual stillness concentrated in one section of the street. Reed glanced once more toward Marcus, then toward his radio, which now remained silent, as if waiting for a response that would not originate from the local network anymore. The absence of immediate communication did not indicate resolution, but transition, the kind that occurs when responsibility is no longer held horizontally between individuals on the ground, but vertically through structured command layers that operate outside of immediate perception. Marcus finally adjusted his posture slightly, not out of tension, but out of readiness for procedural completion, his eyes scanning the environment with calm awareness. The officers nearby maintained respectful distance, no longer attempting further questioning, as if acknowledging that the current stage of interaction required confirmation rather than continuation. Reed exhaled slowly, his gaze briefly shifting toward the horizon line of the street, where everyday movement continued uninterrupted, contrasting sharply with the suspended focus of the intersection itself. The situation had entered a state where action was no longer defined by physical authority, but by communication systems that were now in motion beyond visible reach, leaving those present in a shared moment of anticipation for the next confirmed directive. The intersection had settled into a controlled stillness that no longer felt accidental, but instead resembled a pause imposed by systems far beyond the immediate environment, as if the entire street had been temporarily removed from normal civic time. Officer Daniel Reed stood beside his patrol unit with a posture that reflected observation rather than enforcement. His radio now quiet in his hand, no longer producing updates, but still representing an active connection to higher command channels that had already been engaged. The other officers maintained their positions with disciplined restraint, their earlier confidence replaced by a structured waiting state, where every movement was measured and every glance was reconsidered in light of information they did not yet fully control. Marcus Johnson remained at the center of the scene, unchanged in demeanor, his stance steady and composed, his attention no longer focused on the officers directly in front of him, but on the invisible network of communication that had been activated beyond the intersection. The crowd that had gathered earlier now stood in near complete silence, their presence no longer driven by curiosity, but by recognition that something official and external was in motion, something that did not depend on local interpretation or immediate judgment. A few vehicles continued to pass slowly at the edges of the blocked street, but even their movement felt secondary, as if the main event had shifted away from physical space and into procedural escalation occurring elsewhere. Reed briefly adjusted his grip on the radio, then lowered it completely, acknowledging without words that the current stage of the situation was no longer under his active control. His eyes moved between Marcus and the surrounding officers, reflecting a recalibration of responsibility rather than resistance, as he processed the implications of the directives already received. Marcus subtly shifted his weight, maintaining calm readiness, his expression unchanged, reinforcing the sense that this moment was not unexpected to him, but rather part of a known operational sequence. The younger officer nearby stood still, no longer attempting interpretation of the identification materials, instead adopting the same observational posture as the rest of the unit, waiting for the next confirmed instruction. The air felt heavier not because of tension between individuals, but because of the absence of immediate authority resolution, replaced instead by structured delay inherent to higher-level verification systems. Reed looked briefly down the street, where everyday city movement continued without interruption, creating a stark contrast between ordinary life and the concentrated stillness at the intersection. No one spoke, and no new commands were issued at the local level, as the entire scene remained suspended in procedural anticipation, awaiting the moment when external confirmation would arrive and redefine the status of everything currently in place. The stillness that had settled over the intersection finally began to shift, not abruptly, but through a subtle change in atmosphere that signaled the arrival of something external to the street-level system, as if the moment everyone had been waiting for had finally begun to move from distant communication channels into physical reality. Officer Daniel Reed was the first to notice the change in sound, a faint difference in the background noise of the street, where normal city rhythm continued, but now carried an additional presence that did not belong to local traffic or routine patrol coordination. He lifted his gaze toward the far end of the road, where a black, unmarked vehicle had entered the block with controlled precision, followed by two additional units maintaining measured spacing. The movement was quiet, deliberate, and unmistakably coordinated, creating a visual contrast against the ordinary flow of morning activity. The officers on scene adjusted their posture instinctively, not out of command from Reed, but from recognition that the nature of authority in this situation was about to change again. Marcus Johnson remained still at the center of the intersection, his attention now directed toward the approaching vehicles, his expression unchanged but fully aware of what their arrival represented within the structure of military protocol. The crowd, which had remained silent for several minutes, shifted slightly as people tried to identify the meaning behind the new presence, sensing that this was not a continuation of police procedure but an escalation into a different chain of command entirely. The unmarked vehicle came to a controlled stop just beyond the perimeter of the patrol units. And for a brief moment no doors opened, as if timing itself was being synchronized with internal confirmation signals. Then, without urgency but with complete authority, the rear door opened and a senior military officer stepped out, dressed in formal field attire that immediately distinguished him from everyone present. He moved forward with steady pace, his attention locked on Marcus first, then briefly scanning the officers on scene without hesitation or confusion. Officer Reed straightened instinctively, his posture reflecting recognition of rank and protocol even before formal identification was spoken. The military officer stopped at a measured distance and confirmed identity through a brief exchange that carried procedural clarity rather than emotional tone, and within seconds the verification was acknowledged across channels that were no longer audible but clearly active. Marcus gave a slight nod of recognition, maintaining composure as the situation transitioned fully into military jurisdiction oversight. The officer from the unmarked vehicle turned slightly toward Reed and the surrounding police unit, issuing a calm but definitive instruction that the current detainment was no longer within local enforcement authority and that the situation had been fully assumed by federal military command coordination. Reed responded with immediate compliance, signaling his team to stand down from active enforcement posture while maintaining respectful distance. The shift was complete but not dramatic in sound or movement, instead expressed through the sudden clarity that replaced uncertainty, as roles and authority levels were formally redefined in real time. Marcus adjusted his uniform slightly, then stepped forward with controlled movement as the military officer accompanied him toward the vehicle, not as a subject of enforcement, but as an acknowledged member of active command personnel. The officers on scene remained still, no longer interpreting or intervening, while the crowd observed in quiet attention as the central figure of the encounter transitioned from local custody space into protected military coordination. The intersection, which had been suspended in uncertainty for nearly an hour, now returned to motion in a different way, not through confusion, but through the completion of procedural confirmation that had traveled from the street to the highest operational channels and back again, resolving the moment with quiet institutional precision. The unmarked military vehicle remained at the edge of the intersection for several seconds after Marcus Johnson had been escorted inside, not as a sign of hesitation, but as a controlled pause in movement that reflected the completion of a formal handoff between operational layers. Officer Daniel Reed stood in place near his patrol unit, his posture now fully neutral, no longer engaged in enforcement behavior, but instead observing the final stage of jurisdiction transition that had unfolded in front of him. The remaining officers maintained their positions in quiet discipline, their earlier uncertainty replaced by procedural acceptance, as the situation no longer required interpretation at the local level. The crowd that had gathered earlier remained still for a moment longer, watching as the military vehicle prepared to depart, the tension that had defined the intersection gradually dissolving into structured normalcy. Marcus Johnson was seated inside the vehicle with calm composure, his presence no longer subject to external scrutiny, as the chain of command that defined his status had already been confirmed through direct liaison communication. The senior military officer who had arrived earlier closed the door with controlled precision and gave a brief signal to proceed, and the convoy began to move forward in a smooth, coordinated departure from the intersection. As the vehicles pulled away, the visual focus of the scene shifted from confrontation to resolution, with the street slowly returning to its natural rhythm. Officer Reed exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance as he looked across the now-clearing intersection, acknowledging that the situation had fully moved beyond his authority and into a domain governed by higher operational command. The other officers began to reposition themselves, removing the temporary perimeter that had been established earlier. Their actions measured and orderly as standard procedure resumed. The crowd gradually dispersed, conversations beginning in low tones as people processed what they had witnessed, not fully certain of every detail, but aware that they had seen a formal escalation and resolution that extended beyond ordinary police activity. Traffic resumed its normal flow within minutes, vehicles passing through the intersection without interruption, as if the entire event had been a brief anomaly within the broader continuity of the city. Reed returned to his patrol unit and placed his radio back into its secured position, his expression steady but reflective, indicating internal acknowledgement of how quickly authority structures can shift when higher-level systems engage. The streetlights, storefront reflections, and morning movement of pedestrians once again became the dominant visual rhythm of the environment, replacing the concentrated stillness that had defined the earlier moment. Marcus Johnson, now fully transitioned under military escort, had already left the visible scene, his presence no longer part of the intersection but part of an ongoing operational process beyond public view. The location itself no longer carried tension, only the residual memory of structured escalation and resolution, where every level of authority had responded according to its designated protocol, and then returned to normal function once the confirmation cycle was complete.